Research went on to note that it wasn't just remarried older people who were getting divorced. More than half of all gray divorces are with couples who have been married for over 20 years. So it's not just older people, but people that have been married for 20 plus years, an increase in the divorces of these marriages. And the article goes on. He says, he slurps his soup. She nags him about not putting the dishes in the sink. He doesn't understand me. I get that. I thought after 20 years, the soup slurping and dirty dishes on the table just get to be part of the daily married life ballet. You have history, kids, family, illness, and frankly have lived through a lot of drama that life throws your way. But this article calls this the Tipper and Al Gore syndrome. Does anybody remember them? Former U.S. Senator from Tennessee, former Vice President for Bill Clinton. And it states that their story is much the same as many long-term marriages. After having 4 kids and 40 years of marriage, they simply had grown apart and wanted to go it alone. Tipper asserts that it was not that he was dull and boring or cheating on her, but they are a classic example of a gray divorce. Are people expecting more of a sense of happiness and fulfillment today than they were before? It's possible. And it seems that couples are just not willing to put up with an Irish divorce anymore. And I didn't know what that term meant, but the Urban Dictionary describes this term with related words like the not divorced marriage, abandoned, deserted, dumped, loveless marriage. You may have grown up seeing your parents or your friends' parents going through the motions of marriage and not engaged in a loving partnership. Have you ever been at a restaurant and seen couples eating and not interacting at all? Well, we see a lot more of that today with our phones, don't we, and devices. And many of us just thought that this was the way advanced married couples acted, that was the way it was supposed to be. And some of the reasons that are cited for an increase in gray divorce is that the stigma of divorce is disappearing. It's no longer seen as bad or that you're condemned if you get a divorce. People are living longer, so as you get older, and if you at 50, if you have an expectation of living 20 more years and you look over at your spouse and you think, I don't have to put up with that for 20 more years. I can, have 20 more years of, of a good life with somebody else. Economic gains that women are making used to, women wouldn't get out of a divorce because they depended on the husband being the breadwinner and so on. And so now that there's more economic gains for women, they are more ready to go out on their own. And then also the advent of easy online dating. And so a lot of reasons for this increase, but clearly we see that not only do we need to have a good foundation for marriage, as we looked at last week, but we need to invest constantly in that relationship. So today we are in Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verses 6 through 16. And the quarterly has 3 points that we will be looking at this morning. We see the cry for companionship in verses 6 through 8. We see a call for remembering in verse 9. And then we see the crux for celebrating in verses 10 through 16. So we'll dive right into our text in Song of Solomon, chapter 5. And starting in verse 6, but just kind of a preface for that, with that idea, that point, the cry for companionship. And we know that that's ultimately what marriage is about, is to fill that need that every human heart has for companionship. And probably one of the go-to verses when we think about that, and many times is even read in a marriage ceremony, is from another book that Solomon wrote. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 8 through 12 describes this plight of this solitary person. It says, "There is one alone, and there is not a second, yea, he has neither child nor brother. Yet is there no end of all his labor, neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Neither says he, for whom do I labor, and bereave my soul of good? This is also vanity, yea, it is a sore travail." So here Solomon paints this kind of sad, lonely picture of this person who is not married. He doesn't have any children to leave any material possessions behind for, and yet he still has to work, to satisfy his own needs, and it's just like, what am I doing this for? I'm on this hamster wheel of life and work, and I don't have anybody to leave an inheritance to, and I don't have anybody to share my life with now. And he says that it is a vanity, it is sore travail, it is a toil in life. And he goes on to describe what is much better. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him that is alone when he falls, for he doesn't have anyone else to help him up. Again, if two lie together, then they have heat, but how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, in other words, if you're in a fight, and if one prevails against you, if you have a partner, two can withstand that enemy, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And many people point to that in the relationship, and a lot of times we say that it takes two people to make a good relationship. Well, it actually takes three, don't it? As Christians, we know that. It takes the husband and the wife, and who else? Jesus Christ has to be a part of that relationship, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And when you think about creation, if you read the Genesis account of creation, and over again, when each day of creation, God said that everything He made, it was good, it was good, it was good, except for one thing that was not good. And in Genesis 2:18, He said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet," or one that is like him, to be his partner in life. And so here we see the cry for companionship. And our text starts in verse 6, but I wanted to, and sometimes it just kind of cuts in the middle of the action, but I just wanted to give a little setup for what we're looking at in our text to back it up in verses 2 through 5. And this is the Shulamite woman who's speaking here, and she says, "I sleep, but my heart wakes," or is awake. "It is the voice of my beloved that knocks, saying," and this is what he says, "Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled." Don't we all wish your husbands would talk to you like that, right? But how lovingly he talks to her. "Open to me, for my head is filled with dew." He's standing outside the door, and it's night, and the dew's starting to fall, and it's getting his hair wet. "And my locks with the drops of the night." Well, now the Shulamite goes back to what she's saying. And she's saying, "I have put off my coat, how shall I put it on?" In other words, I've already got my pajamas on, and I'm in bed. "I have washed my feet, how shall I defile them?" So she's already cleaned up and gone to bed, and she's done for the night. And then she says, "My beloved put his hand by the hole of the door, and my bowels," or they use this expression, they used your internal organs to say you felt it very deeply. And we still kind of use some of that language today. When you say you have a gut reaction to something, it just means that you feel something very deeply. "My bowels were moved for him. I rose up to open to my beloved, and my hands dropped with myrrh, and my fingers with sweet-smelling myrrh upon the handles of the lock." And that last verse there, I consulted with J. Vernon McGee here, And he says, a lovely custom of that day was for the lover to place sweet-smelling myrrh inside the handle of the bride's door. And when she rose up and placed her hand on the handle, she discovered the myrrh and knew that he had been there and gone. So it was a custom of that day that myrrh was a resin that they could grind up and use in perfumes and ointments and so on. And so he placed that on the handle of the door. And when she got up to answer the door after she said, okay, I'll get out of bed, then she finds that on the door, but he's gone now. But there was evidence of where he had been there. Well, all this sets us up back to last week. You might remember the passage we had from Song of Solomon chapter 3. And I think the other adult class mentioned that this was kind of a tricky passage for them to kind of work through, because she talks about that she was kind of, she woke up in the night and she was thinking about him and she wanted him to be with her. It says, we said that, she didn't bring him back to the bedroom, but brought him back to her mother's house. Well, it would have been a lot helpful last week if the quarterly had mentioned this, but if you look on page 121, it says, having said that, and this is their view on our passage for today, the episode described in these verses of today's passage could quite possibly reflect a dream. Earlier, the woman talked about a dream in which she had searched for the man, the love of her life, in chapter 3. So they're saying that the passage from last week was actually just a dream, that never actually happened. That would have given me a lot more insight last week if I, thanks quarterly writers for giving me that insight this week. But, and of course, I consulted with another commentary from John MacArthur, and he consents to that. He says, as the wedding time approaches, the Shulamites' expectations grew more intense, and that it is best to understand that this passage from chapter 3 as a dream rather than a historical remembrance. But as we go on now, the guys from the quarterly say that today's passage is a dream. Now she recalled another dream, and this is from page 121, that last paragraph there at the bottom of the page. Now she recalls another dream in which she looked for her love, who now was her husband. In fact, the description of what happened to the woman in verse 7 strongly gives the impression that she was dreaming when it says, let's see, I might have skipped ahead of myself here. In verse 7, when it talks about the watchmen who find her and that they smote me and that they wounded me, and the quarterly writers say that this gives the impression that she was dreaming. In reality, she married Solomon, the king of Israel, and for that reason, she likely would not have been mistreated by the guards. In her dream, however, they wounded her and then disgraced her. So the point of view of the guys who wrote the quarterly is that the passage from today, that it is a dream. But again, MacArthur, he kind of takes a different point of that, because if you look in our passage here, in chapter 5, it says, I sleep, but my heart is awake. And he says, some have suggested that the beloved dreams here, as in chapter 3. However, she acknowledges my heart is awake, indicating that she was not sound asleep. To make this a dream would make the rest of the book a dream, which is highly unlikely. And when the beloved Solomon says, open to me, it appears that Solomon returned home earlier than expected and wanted to give his bride a romantic surprise. And when she says, how shall I put on my coat again, this is her groggy response to Solomon. So we see that she says in verse 6 that she goes to the door and she opens the door, but my beloved had withdrawn himself and was gone. MacArthur goes on to say, by the time she awakens fully and opens the door, Solomon has departed. And she says that when she got to that point, my soul failed when he spoke. And I think about, times, and as we said before, there's kind of a dual interpretation with this book. There is the literal, which looks at the human interaction between the bride and Solomon, but we can also make spiritual applications to this. And you think about times in your own life when God seems distant at times. And I'm reminded of Psalm 42, and John David went over this passage when he went through his series in the Psalms, and we're reminded of a time in David's life when he felt dry spiritually. And he says that he's like the deer that pants after the water brooks. And he says, my soul thirsts for God. And my tears have been my food day and night when people say to me, where is your God? And he pours out his soul within himself, and he tries to encourage himself. He says, why are you cast down, O my soul? For I will still yet hope in God. And verse 9 goes on to say, why he is asking God, why have you forgotten me? So there's times in our spiritual life when we feel separated from God and our heart fails, so to speak. It says her soul failed when he spoke. And then I was also reminded of the book of Daniel when he caught a vision of one who we believe was what we would call a Christophany, a pre-incarnate vision of Christ. And he saw this vision, and when he heard the voice of his words, he fell in a deep sleep on his face. His soul failed, so to speak, when he heard the words of Christ. And that's also reminiscent of what we read past Wednesday night when John David started his study in the book of Revelation. And whether you're here or online, I encourage you to join us in that on Wednesday nights. But in Revelation chapter 1, talking about Jesus, it says his voice was as the sound of many waters. And going on to verse 17, it says, and when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. His heart failed within him when he saw him and when he heard his words. And the psalmist reminds us again that when we have spiritual heart failure, so to speak, we know who we can go to cure that. My flesh and my heart fails, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. So here she is in bed, and she's reluctant to go to the door, so she groggily gets up and goes to the door, and she finds the perfume that he's left on the doorknob, but he is now gone, and her heart fails within her. She goes on to say, I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, but he gave me no answer. And again, there's that cry of companionship, and it works both ways between husband or wife. There is that need for companionship in a marriage. But again, I go back to that spiritual application. You might have heard it said once before, if you feel a distance between you and God, guess who moved? Because he stays the same. He's constant. If we feel a distance between us and God, is that we have drifted away from him instead of him drifting away from us. But then she goes on to say, in verse 7, the watchmen that went about the city found me. They smote me, they wounded me, and they took my veil away from me. Now the guys in the quarterly, they point to that to say that this had to be a dream because this is Solomon's wife, and the city guards would have never treated the queen like that. But MacArthur gives an alternate explanation. He says, unlike what happened in her dream from chapter 3 when she encountered the guards and they did not abuse her and she found her beloved shortly after that, here the watchmen treat her badly. And he says, between the darkness and the unfamiliar features of the new bride, this easily could have happened. So you take your pick. It's a dream or it's not a dream. But either way, she describes a situation where she's reluctant to answer the call to her husband. He leaves, and when she goes out into the city, she is abused by these guards. And of course, the quarterly points out that there's never any excuse for physical or sexual abuse in a relationship or anything. And certainly we know that that's prevalent today, and unfortunately it should not be, but that we should not tolerate that. But it also says that the keepers of the walls took away my veil from me. In other words, they disgraced her. They humiliated her by removing her clothing. And we see another example of that with Tamar. You might remember that after David sinned, some of the things that came home to roost for him was he had a son who lusted after his half-sister. He rapes her, Tamar. And it says after this happened, he put her away from her, and the hate that he had for her was stronger than the, quote, love that he had for her before this. And it says, and she had a garment of various colors upon her. It was the robes that the king's daughters wore all the time. And then his servant brought her out and closed the door after her, and Tamar put ashes on her head, and she tore her garment of various colors that she had on. So that's just a sign that Tamar and the Shulamite woman here were disgraced. They were humiliated when their clothing was taken away. So after now she's searching for Solomon, her beloved. In verse 8, the Shulamite says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if ye find my beloved, that ye tell him that I am sick of love. Now this doesn't mean I'm tired of love and I don't want it anymore. It actually means I am lovesick. And we've heard that term before, right? And so that I am actually lovesick. We see that same phrase again and earlier in Song of Solomon chapter 2 and verse 5. Stay me with flagons, comfort me with apples, for I am sick of love, or I am lovesick. And you all remember those early days when you first dated, right? You were just, lovesick for your husband or your wife, and that's all you could think about, and you wouldn't eat. And sometimes that's a good thing for some of us if we would quit eating for a reason like that. But she's lovesick here. She desperately misses her husband, even though she initially didn't want to go to the door to answer him. Now she kind of sees the error of his ways, and she wants to respond to his cry for companionship. So verse 9 then gives us the call for remembering. And this is, again, if you have a newer translation that kind of gives a heading here, this would be from the daughters of Jerusalem who are responding to the Shulamite woman. And it says, One is thy beloved more than any other beloved, O thou fairest among women. What is thy beloved more than another beloved, that you do so charge us? Again, here a comment from MacArthur is helpful. It says, the wise daughters of Jerusalem twice ask a question that prompts this bride to recall the superlative features of her new husband. In other words, they're trying to get her to remember the reason she married him in the first place. And again, that has, a natural application to us. Sometimes when you're going through a rough patch in your marriage, as you said, he leaves his socks on the floor, or, she can't park the car in the garage right, or whatever it is, you're having that frustration, and you go back to the reason you married that person in the first place. And when you can go back to the beginnings, it's just like we heard last week in that letter to the church at Ephesus. It says they lost their first love, and it says go back and do the things you did at the beginning. And so they're trying to get her to remember, why she married him in the first place. Matthew Henry also has some helpful commentary on this. This question that these daughters of Jerusalem are asking, some take this as a scornful question, blaming her for making such a fuss about him. In other words, why do you think he's so hot above anybody else? Why would you want him? Worldly hearts see nothing excellent or extraordinary in the Lord Jesus, in his person or his work, in his teaching or his kindness. And so we encounter that today, right? If you go to work and you tell people, oh, we had such a great service in church yesterday. Why are you into that Jesus stuff? You know, I mean, they don't understand it. The world doesn't understand why you have your attraction